What up, Brian Rains? Hello! Welcome to our second session of the 2024 Theology on Tap series. Woo! That was weak, but I know you're saving your applause for our speaker, Jenny Matheny, who's going to come up in just a second. But I want to say first, my name is Aaron. I'm the rector at St. Albans. We're so excited that you are here for Theology on Tap 2024. If you are a frequent flyer, you know what to expect. We eat, we drink, there's some merriment, and then we hear somebody really smart and engaging talk about something that hopefully you're interested in, curious about. Maybe it's something you know a lot about. Maybe it's something you don't know about but want to know more. And so we're just so glad that you're here for this. I want to also begin by thanking the Revival Eatery crew. Thank you so much to all of you. Working so hard, and know also Street Dog Cafe, owned by the same folks, is just down here, and we encourage you to check out their pastries, delicious kind of breakfast stuff. Come by for that, and of course continue to eat here and tip generously because those folks are working hard. I want to say also, if you want to know more, many of you are St. Albans folks, some of you are maybe not, or just you lost a bet, so you're here tonight. But if you are curious about St. Albans and want to know more, connect us. Feel free to grab anyone who's wearing one of these. Kara in the back, Garrett there, Andrew there, Rachel Toombs, our director of formation over there. We'd be happy to chat with you. Or if you don't want to talk but want to be more subtle, you can fill out one of our little information cards, which are around on the tables, and put that in the box on the way out. Also, there are little index cards if you have questions, and if, as our speaker gets going, that's for that. There'll be a Q&A time if you're the type of person that likes to put up a hand and ask a question, like Anna Beaudry, you can do that. If you're not that type of person and you just would rather write it down, that's another way to go about it. So glad you're here again, and now I'm going to pass the mic over to the Reverend Garrett Lane, who is got a big weekend ahead of him. He'll be ordained to the priesthood this Saturday. They're still checking some of his older social media posts, so we're waiting on the final results, but it should be fine.
Those pages are buried deep. I have the pleasure of introducing you tonight to Dr. Jenny Matheny, and she is the Associate Professor for Christian Scriptures at Truett Seminary. And tonight she'll be talking about the Old Testament and clothing. This is something that she specializes in, she very much enjoys. I like that we get to have people here who are talking to us about things that are really close to their heart, really close to the things that they're passionate about. So as she's talking, you can feel free to write your questions down, and we'll be excited to get to talk about it with you. All right, without further ado.
She's taller than our last guest.
Ooh, that's awesome, because I'm hobbit size. Yeah. I'm excited about that. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. Oh my goodness, St. Albans, this is a very special community, as you all know, and I'm new to it, and I'm very excited to be getting more involved. I've been at Truett since August. It's been an amazing adventure so far, getting to know Waco. I still quite can't figure out where everything is, but, you just sort of, Google Maps are my friend. Anyways, clothing in the Old Testament. Sorry, is that a bit loud? It's actually an area that I'm specializing in, and it's been kind of a new thing I've been venturing in as part of a research group where we've really been kind of jumping in and looking at clothing kind of like its own character in a lot of ways in the Old Testament. And as you know, part of, I think, the series is reading the Bible well, right, as literature, and also so much more. Rachel and I both went to Regent College, and one of our professors there, Phil Long, has this book about like the art of biblical literature or something like that. And he really, I think, opened up my eyes to the Bible as literary art, like verbal representational art. Because as you're going through the texts, often they're very theologically charged, right? And it's not going to be this linear chronological history. The stories are going to really highlight what the authors want to communicate. And so I love thinking about it that way. When you think of like a piece of art, you have to be very selective, right, with what you choose to put in there. And in the Old Testament, often, there's not a lot of physical descriptions. So if you see that, it's rare and it's important. And so you have to really pay attention as you're reading. One of the kind of exercises that I like to do with some of my students is if you were to create an art piece of the beginning of Exodus, you would probably, normally we think of the Pharaoh as this huge dominating character, right? But then you realize he actually doesn't have a name. Actually, he's not as important in the story. And then you look, wow, the midwives, right? They're named, Shifra and Puah, right? And then you start to see actually God's subtleties in reading the text really carefully really start to pull out some really important theological messages. And I remember thinking, wow, if I was to create an art piece of the beginning of Exodus, I might, just in my theological imagination, create these giant hands of the midwives, right? Like this is what is standing out, right, in this story. Not just this oppressive Pharaoh, yes, very important and awful and, things, they're going to be freed from that. But at the same time, like these are the things that the literature is kind of talking through. So clothing, you think, is that really a big deal? But when you stop and imagine for a minute, dressing for a big day out, I'm from Napa, California, and I recently had my 30th high school reunion. Thinking about what to wear, it's a little stressful, right? You're going to see all the old boyfriends and everybody. And I thought, wow, okay, during our 20th, dresses, heels, 30th, boots, comfy shoes, right? Season of life changes a little bit. It's just interesting, right? That actually dressing can be a little bit stressful. And then you think about any person, if you think about like a job interview, right? That's going to elicit a lot of responses. What are you going to wear? It's not just covering the body, but you're thinking, how do I want to present myself? Often there's, not just in job interviews, but when you think overall, especially in the Old Testament, there are social, religious, and political dimensions to dress. It invokes this desired awareness, anticipated response, and again, descriptions are rare and significant in the story. So, and one of the things about looking at dress in the Old Testament is it encompasses more than just fabric. It can be jewelry, perfume, cosmetics, accessories, and even clothing as a metaphor. So yes, dress is very powerful, especially, even if you think of perfume and you think of anointing, all of those things. Or, so powerful, if you have a middle schooler who has discovered Axe body spray, that might change your life, and your house hallway will have about a 12% visibility for about 35 minutes, right? So anyway, so you think about all the different ways that dress is used. So I'm going to keep track of my time here. And tonight, I'm going to kind of talk overall just to kind of get us introduced to the topic. And then look closely at a passage in Genesis. And I'll tell you why I brought this passage. It's not your probably traditional theology on tap passage, but when a woman is characterized in a particular way, I become very passionate about that. If I think there could be a misinterpretation going on, there can be multiple interpretations often, but I often want to say, hey, let's slow down and read a bit slower and see, has there been some conclusions that have been, jumped to a bit too quickly? And I think with this story there has. So clothing change in a narrative can signal to the reader that a character is constructing or reconstructing their identity. Dress or clothing can communicate different deeds, identity, even advocacy. It becomes a very provocative form of communication, miscommunication, resistance, opportunity. Sometimes clothing moves the narrative forward. And so again, we're meant to pay attention. In modern discussions on gender, dress has become a really important aspect in exploring markers of identification. Dress enters the conversation, and again, sometimes if it violates social norms, there can be a possibility for misunderstanding and miscommunication, and this can have really unfortunate results, such as alienation, rejection, even violence and abuse, right? Which are things that we even can identify with in our culture today. So some examples of dress in the Old Testament that you may be familiar with. We have Esau and Jacob, right? Clothing used to deceive Isaac and get the blessing. This is a very interesting chapter because really you look at, Dad in this story, his eyes aren't working well, but he uses his senses of touch and smell, and he ignores listening, right? He hears the voice of Jacob, but he's a man of those senses, right? Of eating, right? All of that. And so it's just interesting, right, what they pay attention to. We have Saul in 1 Samuel 28, like hiding his, kingliness, trying to deceive the medium at Endor in 1 Samuel 28. He's not successful. He actually, bans what she does, and then he's like, really wants to get in touch with Samuel from beyond. And that's an interesting story of trying to deceive someone through clothing. Dress is also often as a metaphor. Some examples are like in the Psalms. Lament Psalms, metaphor, really this powerful imagery, right, where I'm in sackcloth and ashes, right? I'm lamenting. The psalmist expresses distress, disgrace. In Psalm 35, the psalmist pleads for justice, desiring his tormentors to be clothed in shame and insult. So human justice hasn't done what it should do, so the psalmist goes to God. Can you intercede, right? Can what's done to me be done to them, right, through these prayers, these imprecatory psalms. We also see clothing, interesting, shifts social standing and even political shifts. We have the ripping and tearing of dress as a powerful image in the Old Testament, and at times that can signal the end of a king's rule. We also have Ruth's change of clothes in Ruth 3. Or some of you love the story of Ruth? A few of you, this is where I did my dissertation work. I just think it's such a powerful story of an outsider, right? Like really taking a risk for the value of a community and to really raise the name of the dead, right? Someone that's an outsider becomes this beautiful insider. And I could talk about Ruth all day long. But this famous moment of a change of identity when Ruth is a widow, and then she changes her clothes, becomes available for marriage. And Naomi, her mother-in-law, right, is this, change your clothes, perfume up, kind of sneak over to Boaz in the middle of the night, a little, ask for his foot in marriage, right? It's a very provocative scene. And I love it because it just shows this agency of women in an ancient context where, right, like in some ways it's difficult, right, for women to get things going. But you see these women make these moves and just say, well, yeah, sure, there's a kinsman redeemer that might be closer, but we want this guy, right? So it's really great. And I'll go ahead and read that part in Ruth just because it's so fun. I love it because Ruth's mother-in-law tells her what to do, and then Ruth does it and then does more, right? She's like, and actually, and it's cute because Naomi says, Boaz will tell you what to do when the threshing floor scene. And then actually Ruth will tell Boaz what to do. So Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I seek for you a resting place that will be good for you? In this scene, she's hoping her daughter-in-law will remarry. They've all lost their husbands. It's one of those stories that starts with widows, right? It's a really sad beginning, but it really has some interesting twists. And then in 3, Boaz, our kinsman, whose young women you have been with, behold, he's scattering barley on the threshing floor. Now wash, anoint, and set clothing, shimlah, a mantle upon yourself. Go down to the threshing floor. and do not let yourself be made known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking, right? After he's had a few rounds. And when he does, you'll know the place, uncover his feet, lie down, and he himself will declare to you what you are to do. And then she says, all that you have said I will do. And then she went to the threshing floor and did what her mother-in-law commanded, right? And then Boaz is actually asleep. He startles. And then Ruth ends up saying, I want you to be my kinsman redeemer. And also, she asks for marriage, right? She goes beyond. It's really a great story. And so we see that really powerful clothing scene in Ruth, really moving the story along. And so Laura Quick views this anointing with oil, change of clothing, as this interesting move from mourning to being available or going back to the normal rhythms of life, right? So we see that with Ruth. And also we see that in the story with David, right? When he's mourning with sackcloth and ashes with the death of his son, and after a period, he'll change his clothes and go back to the normal rhythm. So clothing's really an important in the narrative. Another one, one that's one of my favorites is Esther. If you read through the story of Esther, there is so much with dress, adornment, clothing. It's opulent, it's over the top, a lot of humor. And Esther 5 is one of, I think, my favorite scenes because there's 3 verses. It's like one of this like really intense scenes where there's not one word spoken, and it's all about clothing and dress and movement. And it's in this moment where you see Esther putting on her royalty, her malchut, and there's this, like, she changes from, in this story, Esther to Queen Esther in that moment. I'll read it to you. This shift in the text. And it's interesting because the text refers to her as Queen Esther here, and you see the movement right in the first verse. It says, on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes, her malchut, stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace opposite the entrance to the palace. So if you're familiar with Esther, there's been this awful situation where Haman, right, who's, decides he wants to annihilate all the Jewish people. Esther has married the king. Sorry, I'm going to kind of shorten the story a bit for you. He doesn't know she's Jewish. And so in this moment, she's like, my people are being threatened. What do I do? She is an orphan. So she's had a lot of trauma and tragedy in her life, and now she's in the king's palace in a place of safety. But Mordecai, her cousin, is like, you know what? You've come for such a time as this. This is the time for you to advocate, right? So there's been fasting. Everyone's waiting for this moment. So it's in this scene where Esther is about to risk her life for her people. So she puts on her royal robes, stands in the inner court. She has not been summoned, which, if the king decides he doesn't want you in his presence, you can be executed. So as soon as he saw King Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. So as a reader, you're like, whew. He holds out this item of dress, a golden scepter that was in his hand. Esther approaches and touches the top of the scepter. So in that scene, no words are spoken. It's all about dress, movement, right? And in that moment, you see the favor, and the king says, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half my kingdom shall be given. And then a series of banquets, and then this wonderful turn of reversals. And then the Jewish people are saved, and it's just an incredible story. And that's a really fun one to kind of read, to watch for clothing and dress. So my hope tonight is that by slowing down the story, we can see this literary artistry emerge through this story of Tamar and Judah in Genesis 38. This is not a really popular story. It's one that's a little bit complex. I'm glad it's adults here. I always love to tell my students, it's interesting, a lot of Old Testament, sometimes is told in children's church, but man, they're dark, right? If they were Netflix specials, they would definitely be rated M, mature, violence, right? Noah's Ark, it's like you get that one inquisitive kid asking, well, what about the other animals? Like, oh, no, we don't want to, or the other people, we don't want to talk about that. So yeah, it's just interesting. So Genesis 38 is definitely one of those. So yeah, thank you for passing that out. We're going to go ahead and pass along the verses so you can read along. So often, this is a much more complex story than we assume. We begin to see that she's often interpreted in a really negative way. Genesis 38 comes in a kind of like a whole series of chapters about Joseph, right? So from 37 to 50, it's a lot about Joseph, and Joseph in itself is a really fun story with clothing. And Genesis 38 has often previously been thought of as this like interruption chapter. It's like, oh, we're off of the Joseph story, and now we're talking about Tamar and Judah. Like, that doesn't really make sense. But one way to think about it is like a play within a play, or a story within a story. So often, if a character is kind of looked at negatively, I get a little bit irritated, and this is where a lot of my scholarship happens. I think I hear an interpretation, and I think, I'm not so sure about that. That seems like a bit of a quick jump hermeneutically. And I think, for me, part of it is what Russian literary philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin advises against: defining another person. Tamar has been called, she dressed a prostitute. She's like this gold digger or something, right? So in my mind, as I'm reading through the text, I think, well, I think there's more to it than that. And often once we define someone, we're not staying open to one another, right? True dialogue can't happen. True change can't happen. And I think I just really appreciate bringing out kind of the more complexity in the story. Oh, my little iPad got funny. Just 1 minute. See if I can redo this. And so, quick overview. I'll summarize the first few bits that are really dark, and then we'll read together some of the others. So in the beginning, we have, sorry, I'm going to skip through some of this. Death erupts early for 3 in the first chapters of Genesis 38. We have Judah's wife pass away and his 2 sons, Er and Onan. Er was married to Tamar, a woman who Judah carried for his son. This idiomatic use to lift, carry, is used of a wife that's a foreign woman, right? So we see that in the Old Testament. So the ethnicity of Tamar, though not explicit in the text, she's probably Canaanite or Aramean. Her name means date. It's possible like date palm tree. One scholar connects it to the date palm that needs to be pollinated by direct human interaction, thus connecting her childbearing fertility to the critical role of Levere. I'll talk about that in a minute. Here's the dark part. Er is considered evil in the Lord's eyes, and the Lord puts him to death. So now she's a widow. And Judah instructs his next eldest son, Onan, to act as a Levere to provide offspring, a child of inheritance for his brother. So the duty of the Levere is to provide a child so that the oldest son, right, who's passed away, his name will not be lost in memory. So it's a way to say, okay, you won't be forgotten. We can hold on to family land, right? And we see this in the book of Ruth as well. So Judah does not explicitly state that he's to marry her, but to fulfill his duty as a brother-in-law for his deceased brother. And we see this in Deuteronomy 25. So we see, again, Genesis 38 and Ruth 4 are the 2 narratives that talk about this levirate obligation. So again, if a male dies without heirs, the brother's required to produce a son. So Onan is he's a bit of an icky character. He ends up having sex with her, spills his seed on the ground, right? And so he's basically enjoying like the privilege of doing that without fulfilling his duty. So the phrase, and this is another interesting thing, the phrase toward the ground is not common in the Old Testament either. And the other place it's used is Judges 20:21, where the Israelites struck the Benjamites toward the ground. So, in a sense, not only is he not fulfilling his duty, this could potentially be more of a violent situation with this phrase because of this use in Judges. We don't know, but we do know that he is deemed wicked and the Lord strikes him down, right? So right away, a lot of tragedy. So Judah instructs Tamar to return to the house of her father, to remain a widow until his oldest son grows up, Shelah, and then he'll fulfill the duties, right? And this is a very ancient cultural practice, and in other parts of the world today, but it's definitely, maybe foreign to us, but it makes sense then because you don't want to lose the name, right, of these deceased. So basically, though, when Judah sends her off to her father's house, this is like a death sentence, right? It's a form of social disgrace by not having her stay there. One scholar says that Judah is condemning Tamar to a living death, right? So deciding not to wait out her death sentence, this is where she takes action and where the clothing comes in. This change in dress will indicate a whole trajectory shift in the narrative. Judah's last word to remain in her father's house will not be the final word. Tamar's change in clothing is not only going to shift her outer identity, but actually really communicate this ethical struggle for righteousness. He's not doing what he's supposed to do. So I'm going to kind of take matters into my own hands. And again, one of the core values of the ancient household is having children and inheritance for family, land, so that the name of the family will not be wiped out. So thinking about the values of this ancient society kind of helps us see what Tamar's outfit change might mean a little bit more. All right, so she's sent to live with her father's house, removes her widow's clothes, puts on a veil to disguise herself, in a sense, and then we're going to see what Judah's going to think she's dressed up as. So let's go ahead and read Genesis 38, 11 to 19 together. And actually, could I have one of those sheets? I forgot to bring mine up. Oh, thanks. Appreciate it. All right, so we'll just read to verse 19. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So she went to live into their father's house. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me, that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up, went away, taking off her veil, and then she put on her garments of widowhood. So here we see this really interesting change of clothing. So obviously, at first, she's wearing clothes that identify her as a widow. We don't know, it's interesting with clothing, there's a lot we don't know, right, about it. But these widow garments are pretty general. We don't really have a description about their style, color, or fabric, but what it's clear is that they have a particular function, right? Out of the 200 instances of beged, which is garment, the common term for garment, when it is in construct with another noun, it shows its functionality. So it's a garment of widowhood, right? So her identity as a widow is clear. From the death of to the years that passed in her father's house, communicates her identity. But then she sees, right, that Shelah had grown up. And she realized that, hey, Judah's not keeping his promise. So she removes the garments to move her future forward. Hebrew narrative, or Old Testament, is often intentionally ambiguous. It's not always very obvious what is going on. But this is the fun part as readers. We get to really enter into the story and ask questions, find connections. So we kind of wonder, does she want to confront her father-in-law? Does she hope that Judah will remember his promise, right? When I read empathetically, I think Tamar was putting community values up pretty high. If you think back to those guys she was married to, I don't know if I'd want to be back in that family system, right? I might be trying to swipe right and find some other, I don't know. Or do you swipe left? I don't know. It's like the well app for finding people. Anyways, the motif, finding people at the well. Anyways, so it's like, why would you want to jump back into that family system, right? Ugh. Especially when the text, right, had her first two husbands called evil. So here we have this change of clothing. This removal suggests a suspension in her identity. It's not like she's going to just change them and do her single lady thing, right? She's going to change back into them at the end. So we're aware her intention was to see Judah. And I think this is where I get hung up, is people are like, she intended to dress as a prostitute, and this is what her goal all along. I don't know. I find it a little more ambiguous. Feel free to disagree. We're not privy to the information of all that inner dialogue. Does she want to be noticed? We know that she covers up her body to disguise herself, right? So, does wearing a veil mean she's a prostitute? Great question. That's often been what's assumed. So often with that, the two streams of thought are veiling her face means she's dressing like a prostitute to entice Judah, and also maybe the location in town applies, right? Where she's located. So what I want to kind of discuss for a minute is that perhaps she wasn't intending that, but might have ended up going along with the story, right, of what ended up being presented before her. Because women in that culture didn't always have a lot of options, right, for these type of things. So we do know that she turns aside her garments of widowhood, covers her face with a saif, which actually could be a veil, wrapper, or shawl. And again, people have often associated that with prostitution. But the interesting thing is that Judah is the one that assumes she's a prostitute, right? So we'll get to that in a minute. So one of the questions you have then is, okay, where is veil in the Hebrew Bible often associated with prostitution? It's not. So one of the things that's interesting is that the use of veil is very limited and is only in reference to women. The only other occurrence is in a betrothal context. In Genesis 24:65, when Rebekah veils her faith for betrothal, for marriage, right? So some scholars have thought, well, maybe actually she put a veil on, hoping that Judah would see her and take her home to Shelah, right, for marriage. This is what she was waiting for. So that's one interpretation, which I think is interesting. Also, it's such a rare occurrence, and that actually in Middle Assyrian laws, if a prostitute is veiled, it's actually, they're punished for that. You're not allowed to veil. You should be married or a concubine. And so if a prostitute was caught wearing a veil, she was stripped of her clothing, beaten, and hot pitch poured over her head. So anyways, so veils were, again, worn by wives, concubine, and widows. It becomes clear that, and really what I always find is interesting is how do we find other instances of it in the Hebrew Bible, right? And it is one of marriage. So it's interesting with that comparative issue. But honestly, she might not have worn a veil. It could have just been a wrapper or a shawl, right? So again, it's just kind of, we got to slow down there. So another possibility, but we do know she wanted to hide herself. The next possibility is that perhaps it's the location. And this is an interesting breadcrumb in the text because the text doesn't actually associate her location with that specifically. And that is Judah that thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. Sorry, I'm going to check on time real quick. And this word in Genesis 38:15 that we read, hashav, is the same word. So Judah misinterprets her as a prostitute. And it's the same word we find with Eli's false assessment of Hannah being drunk in 1 Samuel 1:13. So it's possible, this isn't the only interpretation, but it's possible that all this was in the mind of Judah, right? He's a single guy, right? He's a widower. sheep shearing time, festivities, right? All of that. So there is a lot of, again, ambiguity in the scene. I'll go ahead and kind of skip down a little bit. And another, let's go ahead and read the second part. Because here is where it's going to get interesting as well. I just want to be careful with the sake of time. Is that Judah, again, avoiding responsibility by sending her home. And again, perhaps then, if she's sitting there and Judah's assuming this and she thinks, well, this is one option I hadn't considered, right? And kind of goes with it. So let's go ahead and read Genesis 38, 20 through 26. And then we'll start to see where some items of clothing become very important in this story. So when Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adulamite, to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, where is the prostitute who is at Enaim by the wayside? But they said, no prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, no prostitute has been here. Judah replied, let her keep the things on her own, otherwise we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, or goat, and you could not find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has prostituted herself. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of prostitution. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. It's pretty intense. And she was being brought out, and she sent word to her father-in-law. If the owner of these has made me pregnant, okay, so in my mind, I almost want to act this out. It's like this amazing scene where it's like, burn her, right? And then all of a sudden, I just imagine her coming out of the tent like, bam, I'm pregnant by the man who owns these. And she holds up the staff, the cord, and the signet, right? Like, who is it, right? And luckily, unfortunately, Judah is honest. But anyways, I just love that scene. I think it would make a great miniseries. Or pop-up book. I actually have like this secret dream of making Old Testament pop-up books totally for adults. Because I'm like, the Leah, it's like after the wedding night, oh, you're not Rachel, right? Good surprise. And then like googly eyes. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, so yeah, if St. Albans needs a project, I will gladly consult. So anyway, so she says, bring her out, let her be burned. She comes out, if it was the owner of these who made me pregnant, and she brings out these items. Take note, whose these are, the signet, right, the cord, and the staff. And all of these that he gave her are incredibly personal markers of identity and authority. It's like giving over your passport, your credit card, right, your driver's license. You don't just hand those over lightly. And so, and it's interesting because when he sends his servant to find her, they actually call her a consecrated, like a kedishah, this like temple prostitute, although it could also mean just an unaccompanied woman. And what's fascinating is he is actually quite worried, and you see that in the text. I don't think it's necessarily that he slept with her, because in that culture that wouldn't have been, as problematic, but that she has his stuff, right? I think that is the thing he's actually probably more concerned. So she comes out, presents these items, and this is where dress in the Hebrew Bible is so powerful, because they become these advocates for her, in a sense, innocence, righteousness, and not a word is spoken, right? I can just see her holding these up. And then Judah acknowledged them and says, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give my own son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again. So he acknowledges he was not doing the right thing. And by, holding these clothing items, right, it changes the whole story in a really powerful way. So I wanted to get to just a couple more things. And again, we are expecting when he sends the servant to look for this prostitute, this is Anna, but he asks for this consecrated woman, Kadashah. And again, it's interesting that he's probably most worried about these articles of clothing of his identity. So again, and it's fascinating that no one in town remembers seeing this woman, right? Like, I think that kind of reinforces this false assessment. In a small town, like, you know who's hanging out, right? Like, who's at the local 7-Eleven, chilling, drinking Slurpees. Or like my poor high school in Napa, it was like right on the main road. So if anybody was smoking, it was like we were the druggy high school, but but it was like the other high schools like hidden in a corner. I was like, we're all doing the same stuff. No. But anyways, yeah. So yeah, you know that people would have noticed her. So here we go, the end. Tamar will now uncover and cover once more, puts back her garments of widowhood on, and as we read the rest of the story, she is declared righteous. And that's one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this story, is that she is declared righteous. Later, the end of Ruth, right? She is honored again. She'll end up having twin babies. So in this burning, right, this judgment, at first, 3 would have died. But because of these articles of clothing, these items of dress, 3 lives are saved. And if you recall, her children are going to be in the line of Boaz, which in the story of Ruth, right, as we're reading through, who else comes through that line? King David and Jesus, right? So I'm just like, I mean, you could just call her a prostitute, but I think there's a lot more going on in this story than just a woman trying to, like, have a baby, right? Like, especially in a family like that, family system. And one of the powerful things of this chapter specifically, and this is your homework tonight. I always give you homework as a professor. If you want to read through the Joseph story, watch for the character of Judah and his change. This is a very important chapter as we get to Genesis 50. And clothing, as you know, in the Joseph story is all over the place in really powerful ways. And these beautiful reversals, right? So anyways, and so I was really kind of excited tonight to kind of go through the story with you because I feel like Tamar is often read in a simplistic kind of way. Oh, she dressed like a prostitute to trick him. But actually, culturally, this is a much more complicated situation of how much power you have, how much agency, what can you do as a woman in an ancient context. And as I'm sure as some of you have read through a lot of the Old Testament stories, women get stuff moving. And I just want to kind of maybe end with this. On the eve of every major theological political transition for Israel, there's been a woman do something really courageous, right? If we're thinking about Genesis, right, Tamar for sure, Zipporah on the eve of Exodus, right? We have in Joshua, Rahab, entrance into the land. We have Ruth, a Moabite woman, risking a lot for this family. And one of the powerful things in the story of Ruth is that Ruth, she gives this oath to Naomi, where you go, I go, where you die, I die, right? And this is on the eve of the monarchy with King David. And in that oath, she is the only woman to proclaim an oath of that magnitude in the entire Old Testament. The only other person that invokes the name of Yahweh in that way is like with David and Jonathan. So it's really fascinating to see these moments of agency. And I really find it fascinating as well when you connect it with articles of clothing, right? And you just see, wow, it's like its own character. Sorry, I'm going to finish up with Genesis. I just love this stuff so much. And the Joseph story is really fascinating. Watch for clothing. It's all over the place, right? He's got this fancy tunic, right? Multicolored stripes. According to the Baylor Theater Department, it also lights up. I don't know if you saw Joseph. Pretty cool. But his brothers, right? Like he's favoritism there. They strip him of it. They use it without saying anything. They have blood, animal blood on it and say, hey, Dad, look. And his dad draws a conclusion, Joseph's dead. Later in the story, one of the most powerful scenes of forgiveness, we have, right, Joseph ends up being carted away. Clothing, again, gets him in trouble, right? The daughter, or the wife of Potiphar, right, rips his clothes off. Is like, look what he did, and it's not true. Joseph and his clothes get him in trouble all the time. But then at the end, his brothers come, and what does he do? He ends up forgiving them offering them clothes in a really powerful scene. And giving and Benjamin even more, right? 5 garments, 300 shekels of silver. So, and one of the interesting things at the end of the whole Genesis story is, as I read it, we have this question that I think at the end of Genesis really captures beautifully. In Genesis 4, after the first murder, right, Cain asks, am I my brother's keeper? It's like, Cain, if you're asking, you probably know the answer to that, and you messed up, right? And so that question for me is like a beautiful lens. Am I my brother and sister's keeper? And then we have Joseph at the very end say, in a sense, yes, I am, right? And so anyways, I could talk on Genesis all day. But anyways, I'll stop there. But anyways, thank you so much for having me.
So, you folks have these note cards. Feel free to write any questions you have, and someone will bring them up here. We have a couple right now ready to go. The first one is going to be getting more to the science of trying to figure out, okay, this clothing is being used, and we don't have an ancient dictionary to kind of like work off of. How are we able to figure out kind of even what's going on in all of this meaning that you're discussing? And there's this word that's used in Judges, and also we can look back to Ruth. Tell me maybe some of the, as an academic, like the science behind working those things out.
Right. Okay, so in Old Testament literature, it's very artistic and intentional. And there's this word that often is helpful when you think about the intertextuality of the Bible. These stories are written with the others in mind, right? So they're meant to evoke other stories. And so even within one book of Genesis, right, you'll have a similar story, right? Like Abraham going into the land, passing off his Sarah as his sister, right? And you see that happen actually a few times. And so it's meant to us to kind of put these together and to see what it means. And even different books within the canon, this is one of the gifts of having a canon, is that they're meant to be read with certain, like an eye to that. And if a word isn't used very often that's pretty intentional. So you can find similarities and comparisons with sometimes the same word, sometimes a similar theme. And so these really can draw out some powerful things about the text, if that kind of helps make sense. And so, yeah.
So building off of that, it makes a lot of sense that the stories would speak to each other, but I imagine they're also kind of speaking to other stories
Yeah.
by other
Yes.
nations. So what are ways that the Hebrew stories kind of reflect and mirror the other kind of stories going on in the culture and the genres, and then are there ways in which they're distinct, particularly about how clothing shows up in these kind of cultural myths?
Right. Oh. Right, yeah. So is there ways that these stories are meant to be read in similar ways? How within like the milieu of the ancient context, maybe they're different? Clothing's interesting because I think right now in the research that I'm aware of, we're looking for a lot of similarities. I think with ancient myth, sometimes what is fascinating is the differences. How, for say like, say in Genesis, the flood narrative is different than, say, some of the other flood narratives around, right? And how God is portrayed. Like, humans aren't portrayed as, in the other myths, like, they're just noisy and we're frustrated with them and we just want to destroy them, and, all of that. But it's, and in the Genesis accounts, like, God comes to save, right? Like, it's more of this redemptive work, this recreation, this continual meeting. So it's really powerful to see the differences. But a lot of the work I think right now being done is what can we draw that we can understand maybe what things looked like, especially with dress and clothing. And a lot of the ways that I kind of enter into the conversation is looking at, especially as a character or, really reading closely, like how does that help either change the story, move the story, especially constructing and deconstructing identity. Like you think of like even like the headdress, like with Esther, we're able to see that, it was probably, if we look in other kind of similar time frames, it might have been this blue-white kind of headdress, not like a crown, you'd think, but, just trying to find like what it could have looked like, which is really fascinating. And just even in Esther, it's just such an opulent book and so ironic, and then you have, Mordecai on the king's horse. And I mean, there's just like, and then the tapestries and the riches, it's just like over the top fun. So yeah, so I think a lot of that is the work there. But yeah, and again, I'm actually been researching this area a bit, but I haven't been into as much of the archaeology of it as I know probably some of our other professors at Baylor who do, household archaeology like Cynthia Schaefer-Elliott and stuff, yeah.
So the first person to make clothing in the Bible is God.
Right, Adam and Eve.
Coverings for Adam and Eve after their fall in Genesis. And then you see people, image bearers of God, we talked about last week, making all these different clothing throughout the Old Testament, New Testament. And I think about Jesus Christ, the only clothing he's mentioned is death. The only other time, other than his birth, his swaddling clothes, and his death, his single garment, is the Mount of Transfiguration, where the clothing becomes bright white, like Joseph in the Baylor Theater.
Yeah.
So here's God making all this clothing, God's people as image bearers making clothing, and as Christians, I feel like we often don't think about our clothing. It's like your spiritual life, which is your Bible reading,
Yeah.
your church attendance, and clothing, it's sort of totally separate from church, other than,
Yeah.
rules about modesty or whatever, those kind of changing social ideas about that. But if God makes clothing, if Jesus' clothing is important, if all these clothing stories are important in the
Yeah.
Bible, how should Christians think about what we wear and how it's part of our spiritual life?
Right.
We keep it compartmentalized, but in what way is it?
Right. That's a great question. And I think, it's a very pastoral question, right? It's interesting. As you say that, I think more than like something prescriptive, I think the one thing in my research, and especially just thinking about even women in the Old Testament, is don't judge someone by what they're wearing. I think, for me, I find that, that's actually, kind of what I'll tell you a story. I had a student when I taught at George Fox in Oregon, and her clothing was very scant, right? But teenagers, I have kids. It's like, you go through these periods where it's like they want to wear, whatever. Actually, and I have an opposite situation where, my daughter just wanted to wear like plaid shirts and cargo shorts, and I was like wrinkled, and I'm like, you know what, kiddo, do you. But so I had this student, and I just saw, and in that context, some of the students were, homeschooled, knew their Bibles, like they, quoted back and forth. And then you have some students in this general Bible class that didn't know anything. And that's actually been my story. I didn't grow up knowing anything. When I went to Bible college, I didn't know who Moses was. Like, it was rough. So, I mean, it's really funny where I'm at now. I remember, boyfriend being like, Moses? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I found out.
You needed a pop-up book.
I feel like we just need to drop the mic there. So good. So this student was like, all the, certain students were looking at her very like, we know what you're like. And first class, I'm talking about the canonization of Scripture, and she raises her hand and is like, Professor, I don't know anything you're talking about. And they're like, yeah, that's her. So she comes to my office after. I get her some catch-up material, some readings, things like that. And I'm one of those professors that what I would do then, I don't do now, but I would put test scores up on a PowerPoint after a test. Not with names, but just, I wanted to nip it in the bud if you're complaining. It's too hard. I'm like, whatever, you're the only one that got that grade, see? So it was like passive-aggressive way to or just aggressive, I don't know. Aggressive. So, because there's always those two, and I'm like, you know what? Everyone else is doing fine. So this student, second exam, top score. And I was just like, yes. I can't say who it is, but I locked eyes with her, and I was like, she was so judged for her clothes. And I knew, like, you're a smart cookie. You just haven't had the opportunity to learn this stuff yet, right? So as far as what Christians should wear, like, if you're in San Diego, I'm sure it's a different conversation than if you're in another part of the world. But I think, it's something to discern in your community, maybe with others, what you feel comfortable in, what not. But yeah, and I think it is an important conversation. But I think more than anything, the thing I always want to do is to be careful not to judge someone. There's often a lot of reasons people wear things and can be misjudged, whether it's a lot or a little close, right? So yeah, anyways, it's a long answer to your question. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good question too, because a lot of the question I often get is if someone's coming to St. Albans for the first time, what do I wear? And I think this is wrapped up in even just what we do on Sundays. And you can see that if you come to St. Albans on a Sunday, we are wearing lots of different things that normally I would not be walking around wearing most of the time. But yeah, that's really good. Okay, so here's actually a good one, I think, and we're not going to go into all of it, but I did want to ask one question here. The question is, why did Elijah and John the Baptist wear similar outfits? Talking about camel hair,